Okay, so we're going to start, Wendy. Yeah. And
Yes.
good afternoon to everybody. Welcome to the webinar. The topic I'm going to be talking about is cognitive biases, looking at their impact and lessons for managers. Hope we can see that this is actually quite topical in terms of what's going on in the world today. And I'd really ask you to think about that and think about questions and issues that you have as I work through the presentation.
Yes, but before we start, I would like to share some important things. So welcome everybody. My name is Wendy Martens, and as Patrick said, within a few minutes we will start with this online masterclass. If you have a question, please make use of the Q&A functionality, and Patrick will try to answer all your questions at the end of the masterclass during the live Q&A session. And furthermore, this online masterclass will be recorded, and we will share the recording and the PowerPoint presentation with you afterwards. And that's it from my side. So now I will hand over to Patrick.
Okay, yeah, thanks, Wendy. I'm a lecturer and a project consultant of quite some experience, so I will share some anecdotes as well as we work through it, and I'm also looking forward to taking questions from you. Just some of the agenda points, the kind of ground I want to cover. First of all, I want to describe and discuss the main cognitive biases. Now, there are many cognitive biases. I'm just touching on I think some of the best researched ones and some of the main ones which are very evident in management, in businesses, and also in politics and economics and finance. I really, when you think about cognitive biases, you're really thinking about the impacts, the effects on judgments and decision making. People make decisions on why do they make those decisions? How can it be that so many decisions are catastrophic and have terrible consequences? Do cognitive biases have anything to do that? So I will try to also to reflect on the impact on businesses and where things can go wrong, and indeed why they go wrong. Now, the world is a different place these days. Geopolitics and economics are already in the forefront. Is there evidence that or could there be some influence of thinking, or let's say biases in thinking going on there? So that's something for you to think about. I don't want to maybe to be too prescriptive in this regard, but let's think about it. And I think knowledge of cognitive biases also is an issue of personal development and learning. We all make these errors of judgment and these errors of decision making. It's not unusual. I think everybody does, but it's a question of understanding them. Just some psychological concepts. I do want to say that when you look at cognitive biases, there are different academic disciplines that come into this. Psychology is, of course, one of them. Economics is another. And this is sometimes the whole study of bias and cognitive biases is also called behavioral economics, which is a new subfield of economics, which is really, I think, filling the gap in terms of economics being the study of rational action. But what about irrationality? So we study what's rational, but rationality doesn't always get the consequences that we want. And it's now understood that this is behavioral economics. There's also biases are also a political issue, but I'll get to that a bit later. Now, these come into a number of academic disciplines that those of you who have done an MBA or Master of Management, for example, would have encountered in your studies: finance, marketing. A lot of marketers, for example, are using techniques to take advantage of our tendency towards bias in decision making and judgment. So it's about the development of mental images, the simplification. Bias is often based on an oversimplification. Some categories here, or schemas and scripts. A schema is a mental category which plays itself out into a behavioral sequence. And also culture has some impact on that. So culture is also a factor here in bias. And just to mention that a number of companies, some of you present may even have been through training in unconscious biases. It's closely linked to cultural factors and diversity and inclusion, which has now been banned in public organizations in the US. So, but it's not, as I'm going to try to show, it's not only about diversity, it's not only about stereotypes linked to cultural differences. It's really about a whole range of other decisions and judgments. Now, okay, in this process of mental categorization of things and then behaving, there are two types of thinking, type 1, fast, and type 2, slow. Thinking fast and thinking slow. This is really the work of, essentially, it's the work of Daniel Kahneman and his associate, Amos Tversky. It's Nobel Prize winning work, which was based on rigorous research over many years. Kahneman was eventually awarded the Nobel Prize for economics. Huh? So it's a combination of he's a psychologist, but this is a Nobel Prize in economics. So it's the essence of it is this. It's very straightforward. You have two types of thinking, two thinking systems. Fast thinking, system 1, which is quick, automatic, intuitive, and emotional. This is our default. It's the first thinking we do when we experience an event or something that demands our response and we need to make a judgment or a decision on it. Thinking slow is more conscious, more deliberative, more deductive, and more logical. It's slower. It requires some deliberate effort. Some examples about this. So slow, rational, logical, deductive, structured. But the errors in decision making tend to come from system 1 and a reliance on system 1. Okay, so Kahneman and Tversky. I'm just going to go through just quickly some of the main biases which they had identified. As I mentioned, this was an intensely empirical process of long experimentation. I'm not going to go through all of them, but these are the ones which I think I'm touching on really for this webinar, because I think that this is where we will get some interesting discussion and perhaps examples. Firstly, the anchoring bias. This is a tendency to rely too heavily on the first piece of information encountered. And this becomes the anchor when making decisions. I did mention that there's a lot of there is expertise. And for example, in terms of pricing, quite a common practice is you might go to a certain restaurant and you'll see that the most expensive items on the menu are the first ones. So that's the first information you get. And that becomes an anchor and it might cause you to spend more money on your meal. Okay, it's also very common in negotiations. So let's say years ago I was negotiating with a trade union, and the trade union, the lead negotiator on the trade union side, tried to anchor the negotiation. He wanted something like 110% wage increase. Okay, so it was that's trying to anchor the negotiation and push the negotiating range in his favor. So you see it a lot. I'm sure, well, I could say that I've seen it in major negotiations going on now in the world. Certainly there's examples of anchoring. So I think just think about that for a minute. The availability heuristic. Okay, the word heuristic really just means mental shortcut. So this is, we are taking it's a shortcut in thinking. It's a tendency to overestimate the likelihood of an event based on the availability in memory. So it's often influenced by recent experiences. So this is quite an important concept in cognitive psychology of salience. I'm going to say a bit more than that, so about the availability bias, and look at some variations. I've got some slides to follow. The representativeness heuristic. Okay, this is the tendency to judge the probability of an event by how much it resembles what we consider to be a typical example. I've again got a subsequent slide, which will explain that, help to understand that a bit better. Here's something which we're seeing a lot of these days, which is the optimism bias, which is the tendency to be overly bullish or overly optimistic about the outcomes of planned actions. Yeah, sorry, that's a mistake there, of planned actions. Kahneman himself said it's one of the greatest deceptions of which the human mind is capable, the tendency to be overly bullish. Just think, for example, of current examples of overly bullish cognitive bias. Some other biases from Kahneman. This one on loss aversion is quite an interesting one. It's the tendency to prefer avoiding losses rather than acquiring from gains. It's very much related to the endowment effect, which is the fact that people often demand much more to give up an object that they would be willing to pay to acquire it. So this is based on the work of Richard Thaler. So we are the essence of that is that we are more inclined to think of the loss of selling something over its actual selling price, right? So the loss is more important than the actual gain, and we tend to overinvest in certain things because we own them. So we tend to value something which we own more than its actual value. Yes, it's the whole concept of endowment. Now, cryptocurrency, for example, is currently, it's again being promoted heavily in certain countries, but there's an issue with it in that, you ask yourself the question why people refuse to pull out of trading cryptocurrency or to sell their crypto. In essence, it's because the losses are perceived as worse than the gains. So people hold on to cryptocurrency because of the endowment effect. Yeah? Now, I've given you also some references and recommended readings. Richard Thaler is really he's also a Nobel laureate for this work, again in economics, even though there are strong behavioral influences and issues. I've given you a reference for a book called Nudge, which is now in a new updated final edition. And these nudges are actually marketing tricks that organizations, business companies do to stimulate the endowment effect. So in other words, to get clients or to get customers to buy into something, to become endowed. If you read this book, you can really see. So I think knowledge of this sort of also helps you in terms of decision making, that it may be that you're being manipulated through behavioral nudge techniques to sign up for something, right? It's all kind of tricks to get you to sign up and get into this ownership thing where you stay a client or a customer. There we have the overconfidence bias, which is the tendency to overestimate one's own abilities and knowledge. I've got a few more things to say about the overconfidence bias. But again, I think we're seeing some examples of this, not to mention any names just yet. The framing effect, that's a tendency for people's choices to be influenced by how information is presented rather than just on the facts themselves. So this is, misleading information that could be presented about prices and the savings you're going to make, presented in a very positive way. 80% price reduction, for example, just presented in a positive way, but it's not really the case if you read between the lines. The hindsight bias is a tendency to see events as having been predictable after they have already occurred. So this is something we tend to do. I'm just giving you an example here that I came across recently. If a colleague is fired, the hindsight bias might lead us to believe this outcome, and we tend to think that the person who was fired could have done, with hindsight, could have done more to prevent that happening. So it's a false explanation about the past and our own predictions. It means we can't learn from our own mistakes and tend to repeat them. So that's some of the problems with the hindsight bias. The confirmation bias is a tendency to listen only to information that confirms our preconceived views. So this is one of the reasons why it's extremely difficult to have an intelligent conversation with people about climate change. And again, again, there are very strong views and being presented and argued. And, somebody who, for example, who believes that climate change is not a problem, you find some piece of information. Somebody did some research somewhere that says actually climate change is happening a bit slower than what we thought. You see, that might, if somebody really doesn't believe in climate change, that they will sign on to that immediately. That confirms my preconceived views about climate change. All right, so that's a confirmation bias. We listen to what we want to listen to, and we disregard the rest. I just got some images here which I found that can maybe help to explain some of these biases. This is the hindsight bias. Yeah, so I always knew it was a bad idea, but this is after the fact. That's a comment, just a cartoon sketch on the confirmation bias, which you can just look at it briefly. It's a bit humorous. I just want to make mention of stereotyping as well. There's a bit of stereotyping coming in here. Stereotyping and a related concept of ethnocentrism, the belief that my culture, for example, my culture is superior to all others. It springs from this type of, these biases are often based on these cultural schemas. Okay. All right. I found this one because the representativeness heuristic, or the representativeness bias, is sometimes a little difficult to explain. But I found this one because it explains it quite well. So this is you have a class here of babysitter. All right, so you hire a babysitter. Now, who would you trust more to babysit your child? So you think you have a mental image of the babysitter, and naturally, most people would tend to say the young lady on the left would be more typical, would be more trustworthy than the young gentleman on the right, who's slightly wild-eyed. And well, would you trust that person with your child? So that's representativeness, judging. It's a judgment, judging the likelihood of things in terms of how well they seem to represent or match particular prototypes, how representative they are about those prototypes. So, of course, the danger of it is it may lead you to ignore other relevant information or lead to closed-mindedness and stereotypes, because it's just what you think is representative, your idea of what is representative. The availability heuristic, also a bit tricky sometimes to describe. But you see in the blue part, you have all the information, right? All the information, which is a lot. But when you're making a decision, on what do you base your decision? So availability is in those bullet points there, whether it is recent, frequent, extreme, vivid, or negative. So these are things that we have in our minds. We're confronted with having to make a decision, but availability is what is available to us to help us make the decision. Kahneman himself gives the example of it's about heart disease, and it might be that you being related to age, and he says that, well, that gives the example of believing that the risk of heart disease, the older you are, is more serious. But you're thinking along those lines because of a recent issue where someone well known to you had a serious problem recently. So it's a recency effect, and now because you have that information, you tend to generalize it to all cases. In other words, all older people are at risk. It may be partly true, but of course it's not completely. Yeah? Also related to the availability bias is the fundamental attribution error. This is where we overestimate the power of the person and underestimate the power of the situation. So when we're looking at the behavior of other people, we giving an attribution to that behavior, we tend to exaggerate personal factors rather than situational factors. So a stereotype might come into that. For example, that we might say a person is always late because that person comes from a particular country where they are not good at timekeeping, or something like that. We look at personal factors when in fact, a person may have come late on one particular day because of a very heavy traffic pileup on that day. So the fundamental attribution error is overestimating personal factors and underestimating situational factors when we are making judgments about the behavior of others. Now, it works a little differently when we're looking at our own behavior. So people don't make objective situational or personal attributions for their own behavior. They tend to attribute their own success to personal factors or dispositional factors, and their failures to situational factors. So it's, for example, I did very well on the test. Because I'm smart, my performance wasn't on the test wasn't very good. I didn't get enough sleep. you know, the lecturer made no sense what he was saying, and he didn't like me or something. So that's the self-serving bias. So it's the other side of the attribution error, which is also a bit linked to availability. Here's something a bit also interesting that's linked, another bias which is linked to or related to the availability bias, which is the halo effect. I see a lot of this in organizational life and organizational behavior. It's explained. Look at the first bullet point. It's an error in reasoning in which an impression formed from a single trait or characteristic is allowed to influence multiple judgments or ratings of unrelated factors. So an example I encountered recently was somebody was a very good sales representative, very always performing well, always doing well with sales, the lead salesperson. And on that basis, it was considered also that he was good at strategy, finance. So one good characteristic was kind of expanded and generalized into a broad halo effect. Yeah, and that can be problematic. So it's the first impressions here is also another point, and the halo effect is sometimes linked to looks. How a person looks and how he or she is dressed and so on. So that's also a factor. You can just see here in the little image there of candidate 1, candidate 2. You see candidate 1 was the successful one on the basis of 1 positive attribute, 2 negative ones. But it was the question of the first impression. Yeah. Candidate 2 was, well, in a sense, didn't get the job in the selection process. 2 attributes were good. The first impression was not so good, yeah, but it was actually a better candidate. So halo effect, I see it a lot. It's a kind of variation on the availability bias. All right, and now I'm introducing you now to the work of somebody else who's written extensively on biases, who is Bent Vlieberg. He has a unit at Oxford University which studies the reasons why major projects, including major infrastructural and architectural projects, why they fail. They don't all fail, of course, but many do fail because of, and one of the, he also, it's also research-based, and I've got this article in your reading list, top 10 biases in project management. These are major projects, but I think they can apply to all projects. I think this could be useful for you because everybody's at some stage or other involved in a project, isn't it? So he has worked with Daniel Kahneman and he was in a kind of academic debate with him on the influence. Well, he said, yeah, all these are cognitive biases, but we also have political biases. So I think it's interesting for you to think about bias as not just being something psychological, but something political, that biased behavior is often politically motivated. And this is an ongoing discussion. And I think it's also interesting because cognitive psychology, behavioral economics is a relatively new field. It's kind of wide open and interesting. So Vlieberg's work is certainly interesting. You see the first one, there's the strategic misrepresentation, which is actually a political bias. It's the tendency to deliberately and systematically distort or misstate information for strategic purposes. Yeah, so Yeah, this is something that's deliberately done, and it's done for political reasons, to get money allocated or to change people's minds. It's Yeah, and he's positioned that as being a serious thing. So why major projects failed? Because the whole purpose of them was misrepresented from the start. The optimism bias, I think this is an overlap with Kahneman, so not to go through that in too much detail. Uniqueness, the tendency to see the project as more singular than it actually is. I've also been a project manager for international development projects a number of times. I think I've to some extent seen all of these biases at work, especially the next one, the planning fallacy, the tendency to underestimate cost, schedule, and risk. Sometimes this is linked to strategic misrepresentation, but we always underestimate. And sometimes in infrastructural projects, this is deliberately done. And, a tender goes in and it's deliberately a bit lower on the basis that after the project is won, we will try to get add-ons and extensions and so on and so on and so on. Overconfidence bias, we've also looked at that, but excessive confidence and overconfidence in one's own abilities. Well, I'm tempted to talk about major political issues going on in the world today, but which I think there's a definite element of overconfidence biases coming into that. But you can think about that, as well as the variation of the Dunning-Kruger effect. This is where people with limited confidence in a particular domain overestimate their abilities. This is also related to personality and personality type, I think. Also, some other biases from Flivberg's work. That's a published article on top 10 biases. On the hindsight bias. Yeah, I think we've covered that already. The tendency to see past events as being predictable at the time those events happened, also known as the "I knew it all along" effect. The tendency to overestimate the likelihood of past events recurring. Yeah. The base rate fallacy, the tendency to ignore generic base rate or prevalent information pertaining to a certain case or sample. So we tend to favor information relating to a specific case. Yeah. But that specific case is a much wider knowledge base, statistical base, and we tend to ignore that. We're just interested in the specific case itself, rather than the broader set of data which is available. The availability bias, I've gone through that already, and anchoring again. These are also examples of. This cat is worrying me. Then there's the escalation of commitment, or the sunken cost fallacy. This is a tendency to justify increased investment in a decision based on cumulative prior investment. So we're reluctant to let go of things because we've invested in them. So we bought a house, and the price of which we bought the house, we so strongly invested in that. Regarding projects, the project may not be succeeding. It may be taking more and more funds, but we keep throwing good money after bad. This is also known as the sunken cost fallacy. There's quite a lot of research that's been done on this, and I can suggest you to read further on it. There's quite an extensive literature. So we tend to escalate and escalate and escalate our commitments, even though it does not make any economic sense anymore. Right. Now, I've also included some material on groupthink, which is uh, yeah, this is also known as the agreement bias. It was first developed by groupthink theory was pioneered by Irving Janis, who uh, was in the U.S. military, and he was looking at certain military fiascos, notably the failed Bay of Pigs invasion, where he looked at what could have gone wrong. You know, these were serious people who got planned this. Why did they make this catastrophic error of judgment? Why? What exactly was the problem? So Janus defines groupthink as a mode of thinking that people engage in when they are deeply involved in a cohesive in-group, when the members' strivings for unanimity override their motivation to realistically appraise alternative courses of action. So it's the agreement bias because we are all motivated to think and behave in the same way. Sometimes it's an aspect of follow the leader. Um, now, something to say about this in terms of diversity and inclusion, because you might think that, well, why, what's really going on? How can we avoid this kind of problem? I just refer you to a business case that I looked at quite a lot, because I was a little bit concerned about it at one stage, which was the case of the Royal Bank of Scotland, which nearly broke the financial system some years ago. What happened was they had a very powerful CEO who's driving ambition. I talk about the overconfidence bias and optimism bias. His driving ambition was to be the biggest bank in the world. Now, for a while, the Royal Bank of Scotland was. After they bought, this has some resonance in the Netherlands, after they bought ABN AMRO, which is a big Dutch bank. After that, they were the biggest bank in the world. But they didn't do due diligence properly on IBM AMRO, which was overextended into the US subprime market. And I think you all know about the crash of 2008. Yeah, so they simply didn't check or do their due diligence on what was really going on in IBM AMRO. So they took on the debt. Okay, the eventual consequences of that was that RBS collapsed and was in danger of bringing down the financial system with it, as the Bank of England intervened. So there was a political intervention and nationalized the bank for a period of time to basically rescue it. Now, there was an inquiry to this, and the inquiry found that the biggest single factor behind the collapse of the Royal Bank of Scotland was groupthink, and which worked as follows. The board of directors was simply too big. Not only that, the board was entirely representative of the same group of people. In other words, they were all the same nationality, they were all men of a certain age, of above 50. They all went to the same schools, and they all thought and behaved in the same way. And you couple that with autocratic leadership, and the overconfidence bias, initial successes, and it was a kind of recipe for disaster. So that's the problem. The problem with the agreement bias is not wanting to everybody going in blindly in the same direction, everybody going in the same direction, rather not enough oversight, not enough critical discussion, not enough thinking, alternative thinking, intolerance of different points of view. All of this is tied up in with groupthink. I find it quite difficult to explain this in certain countries where, you know, critical thinking is not seen to be harmonious. So there are some cultural issues which come into this as well. These are some symptoms of groupthink. The, you know, illusion of invulnerability. People think that they cannot be wrong in any way. A belief in the inherent morality of the group. The group never questions that is on the side of truth, justice, and goodness. Yeah. What are we seeing today in the world? Collective rationalization. Yeah. Members reassure each other constantly. Out-group stereotypes. Yeah, that's a problem. So I'm, you know, getting into this issue of stereotyping in biases as well. For example, in the Bay of Pigs case, there were stereotypes about Cuba. The Cuban Air Force was seen as obsolete, the army as weak, Fidel Castro as stupid or wrong. So stereotypes about the others. Self-censorship. An individual may not want to be in an isolated dissenting voice. There's a pressure toward uniformity, illusion of unanimity, an atmosphere of assumed consensus. Silence is taken for consent. Those are the symptoms of groupthink. I'm sort of ending up this part of the webinar with this because I think this is one of the biggest problems we faced with at the moment. This agreement bias. Some issues about groupthink in every homogeneity of group members, social background, idea. Yeah, I gave you the example of the case of Royal Bank of Scotland, lack of tradition of impartial leadership. Yeah, it can happen in any group where members consider loyalty to the group more important than the action it decides to take. Not all cohesive groups end up succumbing to groupthink. Cohesiveness is necessary, but not a sufficient condition for excessive concurrence seeking. Then the Abilene paradox, I've given you a reading on that. It's really about it said Jerry Hall, who developed this, said it's not so much about managing agreement, it's about managing disagreement. So the group of people collectively decide on the course of action, even though none of them may agree with it. They're all thinking that along the lines that they want to be together with the people. They want to be aligned with the preferences of the others and don't want to upset anybody. I've given you some references and readings there. Which perhaps I can come back to. And then I'm getting to, I think, Wendy, this is about the time that
yes,
we wanted to be in terms of questions and comments. I'm going to get up, but I'm listening. I have to just...
Okay, sure, no problem. Yes, we have a lot of questions for you. I'm not sure if we can answer them all, but otherwise you can send Patrick an email afterwards and he will try to answer your questions via email. Well, the first question that we have is from Saga. Hello, my question is directed towards the professor. Can scent marketing used by fast food companies to attract customers also be covered under nudge marketing or bias?
Yes. Yes, they often, nudge marketing is often done to do that. I think the endowment effect is a big aspect of that. You know, trying to get customers to respond to, you know, some snappy advertising, which, you know, tries to get them to take advantage of a bargain or a loyalty provision. I would really encourage you to read, actually, Nudge by Thaler and Sunstein is there's a new edition, a relatively new edition, which is the final edition, updated version of the book. It's really very, very helpful in getting us to think about when we're being nudged on the one hand, also to think how we might use the nudge in a constructive way. I mean, I know I did use the word manipulation, but it's sometimes clever, and it doesn't necessarily have to be unethical. But I think what I would say to you is always think before you rush into something. Sometimes we rush into things.
Okay, then we go to the next question from Sang Tran. How to adapt or improve confirmation bias situation at work provided by your middle-aged boss who appears to be conservative and has negative thoughts on what you do in an unjudgmental way. For example, you wear a nice outfit and you are out of the office for 1 or 2 hours and he thinks you go for job interview. Or you enjoy the sun with another colleague and he thinks you two form an alliance and create unharmony in your team.
I'm just trying to see how that's a confirmation bias. If he thinks you're not working hard enough, and he sees you sitting in the sun in your lunch break, he assumes that that confirms his bias that you're actually not a hard worker. Well, depending on the dynamics of your relationship with him, I might be open with him, and I might say, is this not a confirmation bias? Do you have an impression about me? What is it, based on the real facts or based on your preconceived ideas? Yeah, I think sometimes with this knowledge about what's happening, and if a person might be biased, if you bring it to it's an unconscious, it's a mental shortcut which is unconscious. But if you bring it to consciousness and say it for what it is, actually you can take you can take the initiative, but also do it. Obviously, it also needs to be handled quite carefully.
Yeah. And let me see. Then we have another question. How do you avoid this halo effect if the person always performs good, but may not be really a positive person?
The halo effect is where a person may have one positive trait. He or she might be a very good salesman or a very good IT security expert, but actually, or something like that. But that's just one positive point. But actually, it's a bad people person, or a bad. But you do have multi-skilled people. That's for me a good manager. A genuinely multi-skilled manager might have a halo, yes, as a star of the organization, but that's genuinely deserved. The halo effect is usually it's not deserved because somebody who's not suitable for the job was actually put in the job on the basis of one positive characteristic. I also didn't mention the converse of the halo effect is the horn effect, where it's, let's say, one bad negative characteristic causes the person to be negatively evaluated, even though he or she is a genuinely good worker. But just one bad characteristic of, let's say, a sloppy dress or weak presentation skills or something like that, and then unfortunately, but it's a person who's genuinely good. So it's really the overgeneralization to one specific characteristic. That's the halo effect.
Okay, then we have another one. How do biases differ between individual and group decision making?
A good question. Most of the biases that I've gone through tonight are about individual decision making and individual judgments, and it sheds light on why decisions are wrong or why decisions can be incorrect. You know, why are they incorrect? And it's often because of a cognitive bias. I deliberately ended up with groupthink because this is essentially a group problem. This is why groups don't uh, don't make the right decisions, because usually it's because of groupthink. It's sometimes because of overconfidence bias, or the Dunning-Kruger effect, where I mean, you work with somebody who thinks he knows best, and there's not very. I've certainly worked with people like this before. There's not much discussion. It's just one person doing all the talking, and one person deciding, and and then you get a variation on groupthink, which is follow my leader, not wanting to upset the leader, and so that's really how I structured it: is to look at the best known individual essentially on individual errors of decision or judgment, which affect a variety of, let's say, management problems and so on. But then there's this issue of agreement and disagreement in groups and what goes wrong. And it's usually because of groupthink.
Okay, then we have another one. Are some biases more prevalent in certain industries or leadership levels, as an addition to the project management biases, for example?
Yeah, I included Flivberg's work because I believe it's very on specifically on projects, because I think to some extent or other we are always busy with a project. We're always busy on a task force or a team or something. So it comes into everything. Yeah, sorry, just say it, repeat the question, Wendy.
Are some biases more prevalent in
certain industries?
Yes, or leadership levels?
I think it's throughout. I think the agreement bias, which we concluded with, is probably more at higher levels. At higher levels, indeed. Overconfidence and optimism. This is often problems with higher levels. And as for certain industries, no, I think it's throughout. I don't think there's any. Yeah, it does depend on the nature of the job. I had to deal a lot with anchoring early in my career because I was involved in negotiations, and I certainly learned a lot about anchoring. Yeah, I don't think so, but it's a very interesting question, and I will definitely give it some thought. So please, stay in contact about that.
Okay, then we have a question from Beverly. Thanks, Patrick, for this very nice, interesting presentation. My questions are: one, what ethical guidelines should be established to prevent the exploitation of cognitive biases in political and business settings?
Well, ethics is extremely important. I'm really disturbed about the, attacks on diversity and inclusion, which is seen to be a woke, part of the woke culture. Yeah, well, actually, I think, diversity is also about diversity of thinking and diversity of opinion. And I think ethically, the ethical protections or the ethical safeguards, if you like, should be, about having some processes, some systems for how meetings are conducted, how agendas for meetings are determined. And I think ethically, I think is also a very good question. I think ethically, you can have some guidelines in terms of giving each person a chance to say something, to be aware of biases. And this is why I find it quite upsetting that there's a move against training in unconscious bias, because it's not only about wokeness and so on. It's really about the best, enabling the best decisions to be made. So good agendas, some rules about listening and not interrupting, and simple techniques like a tour of the table, allowing people to have their say. Some of this is cultural, so culture is always a factor. But I think it's in terms of overcoming the negative effects of cognitive biases. It's these kind of principles and rules, if you like, for things like running meetings. It becomes more important higher up in the organization, but it's also important on the production line, and certain total quality management and Kaizen principles and so on also allow for suggestions by everybody to improve work processes. So yeah, I'm glad you asked that question. Actually, it's certainly relevant, highly relevant.
I think we just have time for 2 more questions, and there are a lot of questions left. So please feel free.
I'm just going to turn the light on.
Yeah, sure. Please feel free to send Patrick an email. His email address is mentioned on the slides. Okay, here another one. What is the impact on decision making when various biases are confounded? Has this impact been studied in some cases?
When various biases are
combined, yeah.
Combined.
Yeah, I think combined.
Yeah.
That's what
yes, good. I think that a lot of these biases work together. They're not just in isolation. It's not to say, oh, that person, it's just it's the confirmation bias is constantly at work with him. So they can definitely work together. About research was the other part of the question.
Oh yeah, that was from Beverly indeed, I think. At least oh no, has this impact been studied in some cases? That's the question.
Yes. Well, the pioneers, if you like, Richard Thaler is still going strong with the endowment effect, and Kahneman passed away very recently. But it was all the work was empirically based. So most of these biases I discussed this afternoon. Most of these biases are research based. It's based on intensive experimentation. And I think it's ongoing. I think I would really encourage you to read. There's a lot online, a lot of easy and quick information you can get online, and some of these books and articles are recommended. Yeah, they will enhance your knowledge. Yeah, just to say that regarding research, behavioral economics really started. I did mention it was because we have to understand irrationality, and economics is rather weak when it comes to irrationality. But so we need to understand this. So just really to look at hedge funds and financial instruments and so on, where things go wrong, and it's all to do with behavioral economics and all to do with cognitive biases. But I think it's since expanded beyond that into all aspects of decision making.
Okay, Patrick, what shall we do? One more question?
One more question is good.
Let me see. Is there a question you prefer to answer, or shall I just take one? Okay, here. How to handle a toxic coworker who is always thinking he is right and others are wrong and have high expectations? Difficult question.
I think I would give it. Yeah, I mean, it sounds like the Dunning-Kruger effect to me. You know, maybe somebody who has actually some limitations, but always believing himself to be right and telling others they're wrong. Yeah, well, of course, you need perhaps to find the right words to put this toxic person in, show him what he's actually doing and the effects it's having on you. Yeah, in a similar situation, I recall doing something like saying, well, can you allow everybody in the room to say something? And then, you know, to just to try to change the circumstances and try to change the behavior. But otherwise, you know, I could also suggest taking, you know, making some kind of complaint if it doesn't stop. But the problem with biases is a person, although it's more and more is known about cognitive biases and more people are becoming aware, still so many people are not aware, and they just fall into this kind of negative ways of thinking, stereotypes and so on every single day. And but I think I would just say be a little bit assertive, don't be passive. Even if it is a bit difficult, and sometimes it's difficult for cultural reasons, but even if it's difficult, try to express your unhappiness with the situation. I know that can be difficult, but it's worth it. It's worth a try.
Okay, well, for those who submitted a question and your question is not answered yet, please feel free to contact Patrick Martens on the email address shown on the slides. Well, Patrick, thank you very much for this interesting masterclass. And also, of course, thank you to the audience for joining and for submitting all your questions. And we hope to welcome you in one of our future online masterclasses. So keep an eye on our website. And for now, bye-bye. Thank you.